was supposed to be a simple overnight stay, a routine stop on a business trip. Jonathan had traveled for work countless times, but this time felt different. The hotel was an old, grand establishment on the outskirts of a small town, a place that had seen better days. The kind of place where you could almost feel the weight of history in every creak of the floorboards and in the dim, flickering lights. Jonathan had arrived late in the evening, exhausted from a day of meetings. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a polite but distant manner, handed him a key. Not a key card, but a brass key, attached to a large wooden fob with the number 713T engraved on it. The room was on the 7th floor, at the very end of a long, dimly lit corridor. As Jonathan walked to his room, he noticed how silent the hotel was. The kind of silence that makes you uncomfortable. The kind that makes you question whether anyone else is even there. But he brushed it off. He was tired, and all he wanted was to sleep. The room was old-fashioned, with heavy drapes, a large bed, and an antique dresser with a mirror. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and something else, a faint, musty odor that seemed to seep from the walls. Jonathan quickly unpacked, took a quick shower, and got into bed. As he lay there, he noticed how cold the room was, colder than the rest of the hotel. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself and closed his eyes, trying to drift off to sleep. But sleep did not come easily. He heard noises, faint, almost imperceptible. At first, he thought it was just the old building settling, but the sounds were too deliberate. A soft creak, like footsteps, followed by a faint scratching noise, as if something was being dragged across the floor. Jonathan's eyes snapped open. He sat up, straining to hear, but the noises stopped. Convincing himself it was just his imagination, he lay back down. But then he heard it again, this time louder. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, coming from above him. His heart started to race. He got up, turned on the light, and looked around the room. Everything seemed normal, but the noise persisted, growing louder and closer. Jonathan decided to investigate. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, half expecting to see something. Someone. But the corridor was empty, the same unsettling silence hanging in the air. He stood there for a moment, listening, but the noises had stopped. Shaking his head, he returned to his room, locked the door, and eventually drifted off to a fitful sleep. The next morning, Jonathan felt uneasy, but tried to brush off the events of the previous night as fatigue playing tricks on him. The day passed quickly, with meetings and phone calls occupying his time. He returned to the hotel that evening, determined to get a good night's rest. But as soon as he stepped into the room, the coldness hit him again, even more intense than before. He noticed that the mirror on the dresser was fogged up, despite the room being cold. A shiver ran down his spine, but he tried to ignore it. That night, the noises returned, more intense and more terrifying. This time, it wasn't just the sound of something being dragged. Jonathan heard whispers, unintelligible and low, but unmistakably voices. They seemed to be coming from the walls, from the floor, surrounding him. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to communicate with him. Jonathan, now wide awake and terrified, grabbed his phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. The lights began to flicker, and the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows in the corners deepening. Suddenly, the door to his room slowly creaked open on its own. Jonathan froze, staring at the door as it swung open to reveal nothing but the dark hallway beyond. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Panicking, Jonathan rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut. The whispers grew louder, almost screaming in his ears now, and the room's temperature dropped further until his breath was visible in the freezing air. Desperate to get out, he ran to the window, hoping to escape, but when he pulled back the heavy drapes, he was met with a terrifying sight. The window was bricked up from the outside, as if it had never been a window at all. Jonathan's fear turned to pure terror as he realized he was trapped. The room, once just cold, now felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. He backed away from the window, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of escape. Then, the dresser mirror caught his eye. The fog had returned, and this time, it wasn't just a smudge. It was a handprint, slowly appearing on the glass as if someone were pressing their hand from the other side of the mirror. Jonathan watched in horror as the handprint grew clearer, followed by another and another, until the entire mirror was covered in handprints, all pressing from the inside. And then he saw it. His reflection in the mirror wasn't alone. Behind him, just over his shoulder, was the faint outline of a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face pale and twisted in an expression of agony, her eyes locked onto his. Jonathan screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet the presence was palpable. The whispers turned to guttural cries, filling the room with a cacophony of sound that made him cover his ears, sinking to the floor in terror. Suddenly, everything stopped. The cries, the whispers, the cold, they all vanished in an instant. The door to the room creaked open once more, this time revealing the hallway, bathed in the soft glow of the hotel's dim lights. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his things and bolted out of the room, not stopping until he reached the lobby. The receptionist looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "I need to check out," Jonathan said, his voice shaky. "Now." The receptionist nodded, as if she expected this. She didn't ask any questions, didn't try to convince him to stay. She simply handed him the bill, which he paid without even glancing at it. As Jonathan turned to leave, the receptionist spoke, her voice low and almost sympathetic. "You're not the first to leave early, Mr. Carter. Room 713. It's an old room. It has a history. We don't usually put guests in there, but we were fully booked." Jonathan didn't wait to hear the rest. He walked out of the hotel, the cold night air hitting him like a wave of relief. He got into his car and drove away, not looking back once. The next day, Jonathan found himself unable to shake the experience. He did some research and discovered that room 713 had a dark past. Decades ago, a woman had been found dead in that room under mysterious circumstances. Some said she was murdered, others believed she took her own life. But ever since, guests who stayed in that room reported strange occurrences. Cold spots, whispers, and even sightings of the woman's ghost. Jonathan vowed never to speak of it again. But the experience stayed with him, a shadow in the back of his mind that he could never quite escape. He avoided old hotels from that day forward. And every now and then, he would find himself waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, certain that he could hear whispers in the dark.